So today we are going to have the second conversation dedicated as the first one to Friedrich Nietzsche. And I prepared about 10 questions. It's actually those questions which were in the introduction to the previous video.
Mm-hmm. I read the description along with everyone, probably with everyone else, and said, oh no, those sound like awesome questions.
Mm-hmm.
So I knew we had to do a second one.
Mm-hmm. Actually, well, this month I was reading a little bit Nietzsche in Russian language, and I came up with new questions, but I decided that I'll put them off for the next conversation.
Okay.
Okay.
To be honest, I haven't. Oh, sorry, I haven't looked at those list of questions on the description of the other episode since it came out, so I didn't actually prepare for them. So it doesn't matter either way. I'll be just as prepared.
Yeah, I don't think that it's necessary to prepare. I mean, just take them and
live
see.
Dangerously.
Yeah. It's much more interesting and spontaneous, where you kind of prepare everything beforehand, and it's not so exciting. But anyway, so what does it mean to be a free spirit? And what's the difference between like how Nietzsche thought about this and how the concept evolved in our time? Was there any evolution, by the way?
So the free spirit first appears in Human All Too Human, or that's the first time he uses the term. And it's interesting because in that book, he actually he presents the free spirit in contrast to the bound spirit. And you could probably translate that a bunch of ways, but it's basically the free spirit. It's really easy to understand what the free spirit is in that context, because the bound spirit, the way he talks about it, is quite simply somebody who's still bound, we would say mentally, emotionally, spiritually, by the traditions of their society. And more than that, the traditional beliefs, the traditional categories. One of the things Nietzsche, I think, was ahead of many of the, what would you call them, analytic philosophers, or the Wittgensteinian types, is that he was very much aware that the categories that we create, the linguistic categories that we create, are a sort of shared, connected net of consciousness. And that just by speaking the same language as your community, you sort of you have the voice of the community in your head. And that doesn't just apply to like your language, such as English or Russian. Actually, I mean, I know this is interesting territory for you, since you spend so much time thinking about language and the nature of thought. But even within a language proper, then you might consider religions have their own language. They have their own lexicon of terminology. And I learned this, for example, when I became very interested in Buddhism. You first hear all these concepts like sorry, my Sanskrit's not as good as it used to be. Tathagata Garba, or very esoteric.
Tathada Kabarga.
It's Tathagata, but I think it's and I'm sure I'm getting my tones wrong and how you're like supposed to say it, but it means that means the womb of the Buddhas, basically. And so that sounds like a very esoteric term when you first start, but as you keep going, like you realize you start memorizing all of these terms, and you start just saying them when you're talking to other people who know about Buddhism. You're saying all of the same language. You realize, oh, we're speaking the same language. We have a little our own little lexicon of terms and concepts that I've become integrated into, right? And so that's the way I think I would explain the bound spirit, is somebody who exists within that lexicon of terminology and is bound by it insofar as they cannot think outside of that existing lexicon. And a lot of people might think, well, in today's terms, I'm not, how could I be a bound spirit? I don't have a religion. But I would dispute that for most people.
Language, right?
Yeah, well, in the morality, we have a secular religion, for example, in America, and it informs our whole moral thinking. And so I think that's where it comes out a lot today. So the free spirit, by contrast, obviously is the person who is able to be free of that. The difference, I guess you asked about, Nietzsche contrasts, so he develops the idea of the free spirit quite a bit after Human All Too Human. Later, he would contrast it with the Freidenker, or free thinker, because free spirit is Freigeist. We could break down all the German in that, but he basically takes the time to distinguish it from the free thinker, insofar as it's not just, I think Nietzsche is very aware that if you just flippantly say, well, I'm free from all of that, I'm free from all of my traditions and morality and moral assumptions, what's going to happen to you is that you will still hold those assumptions, most likely, and they'll just come out in unconscious ways or be channeled into other things. Or you'll end up believing another set of assumptions, or you'll end up, vulgarly being suckered in, or you'll be suckered in by the just vulgar contrast of, well, if my original mental framework was not what I believe, I must believe in the opposite of that now. All of these sort of pitfalls. And so the free spirit, Nietzsche is sort of imagining a philosopher who does not fall victim to that. And so how do you proceed out of being a bound spirit? And what he says is, it's sort of counterintuitive, because when we think free spirit, we think of somebody sort of like, the mental image that comes to mind is somebody sort of like dancing through the hills, totally liberated, running about, right? Nietzsche says in Human All Too Human that you have to proceed at a tortoise's pace with your studies, and that basically the way to be a free spirit isn't by just proclaiming that you reject all these ideas, but that you so thoroughly learn, we could say that you so thoroughly understand, that's probably better, understand the lexicon and the conceptual network that you're coming from, usually out of, so Nietzsche, for example, when he was young, he was very much a pious Christian. When I say young, I mean like a child, a kid. He was the son of a pastor. And he, from a young age, memorized all the hymns and could quote from the scripture and impressed everyone. They all thought, our son's going to be a prominent theologian, most likely, because he is so absorbed with Christianity. And that would be my answer. That's how the free spirit, what Nietzsche calls passes through many convictions, is what he says is required. Is that it's not just by declaring your independence. You have to so thoroughly be absorbed with your convictions that you reach the limit, so to speak. You reach the end. You find out, all the theologians, for example, they can tell you all of the most contradictory and problematic things about Christian theology. They've been debating about it for thousands of years. They know all the issues. And that's why, every one of those theological issues, by the way, is a new sect that comes off. Is the Trinity three different essential beings, or is the Trinity one being with three natures? Oh, okay, what's the nature of those three natures? How do they interact with the Trinity? Every one of those is a question. And so that could be rife with contradictions if it's not resolved. And so that is how, in Nietzsche's view, you proceed through what would we say, the lexicon, the conceptual lexicon that once bound you. Is you understand it so completely, and usually that comes from somebody who wholeheartedly believes in it. And then by doing this multiple times, right, by passing through conviction after conviction, eventually you start to build up a sense of separation between yourself and all of these mental lexicons and see them for what they are.
Is it a kind of sophisticated version of skepticism, when you do not simply reject it, but you reject it not because you don't like it, but because you kind of become an expert and the lexicon and the tradition better than anybody else who also a part of this tradition. You kind of grew out of it and then you try to find something which may be like you maybe even push or move the tradition forward by suggesting a new way of thinking about the same tradition. It's like rejection. It's not necessarily should be like I've read some works on Nietzsche and Christian again theologians. They take him and they try to analyze his works and say, you know, it's very important for us to understand all these points which he showed, like some weaknesses in Christianity.
Yeah, well, and I mean, if you are, I mean, there's nobody better for arguing against a Mormon than an ex-Mormon. There's nobody better arguing against the Islamic faith than an ex-Muslim. I mean, the people who have the most biting, incisive critiques of any system of thought are the people who used to believe it wholeheartedly.
But and, what's is there anything new about it? Because we may say that in Christianity, the Christ is embodiment of Jewish tradition, right? The Bible, and then he suggests a new path, and he becomes this new figure who actually grew out of Judaism. And it seems like Christ may be a free spirit according to this previous previous religion.
I think that's so there are times when Nietzsche seems to entertain almost that idea, but that's where we would have to get into like his specific criticism of Jesus, because again, with Nietzsche, everything's about instincts, and so he thinks Jesus had such like, what does he say, that basically all of Jesus's type indicates such a profoundly sensitive soul that every sensation strikes too deep. And so, and that none of the other Christians had the instincts of Jesus, which is why they couldn't measure up to them, which is why he writes there's only one Christian and he died on the cross. And so it is almost like with Jesus, we could almost say that maybe Jesus was like, because, this leads him, this is Nietzsche's psychoanalysis of Jesus, basically, is that this instinct, this profound instinct to deny the world leads Jesus to this idea of the kingdom of God is within you, this immanentist denial of the material world in favor of the spiritual world. We could even say that maybe Jesus isn't a free spirit because maybe he never really was like of that. Maybe he never really was a I don't want to say he never was a Jew, because he obviously was ethnically, but that he never really was like a believer in that religion. Because like there's a line that Nietzsche quotes. And so I don't know. I mean, this is where it just gets into terminology. Maybe that's somebody who you could say is like a truly free spirit, that they've never been bound by your ideology to begin with. And maybe that's just like an extraordinary type of person we should respect. But there's a line that Nietzsche quotes from, which I think he's actually paraphrasing from, I'm trying to remember what part of the Bible it's from, but where Jesus tells his disciples, does it not, the Pharisees are calling him a blasphemer, and he says, does it not say in your law that all of you are gods? And so why do you say that I blaspheme for saying that I am a son of God? The law was for mortals. What are laws for us? What are morals to us sons of God? And so things like that Jesus said, that Nietzsche quotes admiringly, that there is an aspect to Jesus's denial of the world that leads him to be totally free from their law, this idea of morality as law,
and be
God's law you're under.
Yeah, be bounded by certain restrictions. Okay.
Yeah, well, and he's also, there's the term Vogelfrei, which so at the end of the gay science, there's something called the Songs of Prince Vogelfrei. Vogelfrei means bird free in German, but it's the word they use for outlaws. So somebody who can kill on sight because they're living outside of the bounds of the law. And it's, I think it's such a beautiful way to describe an outlaw. He's free as a bird, basically. But that is the impression I get with Jesus. He's an outlaw of God's law, and of course the laws of men, as we see from what happened.
What is now, like, how does this concept, how is this concept perceived now? Free spirits. Is there any difference in kind of our understanding, or
I think that, sorry.
we simply just continue like thinking about it in terms of traditional views and like some kind of new paths? Are there new paths for us now out of modern tradition or out of modern culture, whatever it may be?
I think the idea of the free spirit or the path of the free spirit is probably more important than ever, because we have done basically what Carl Jung warned us of doing. Because we have, one of the things Carl Jung said was that whenever the contents of the psyche, whatever is suppressed into unconsciousness, becomes projected onto the external world and experienced as an objective fact, right? And that's what we've done with our morality. Like modern people, okay, I'm going to make a bunch of general statements that somebody could say, well, technically that's not true, and there's this many Christians still around. Speaking of my own country and the West, the Western Europe, and the mindset and the people, the direction that things are going in, we are heading in a secular direction. Most people would say morality is relative. They might hold to a couple objective moral truths, but mostly we have our own set of beliefs and our own morality and our own dogmas about how about what reality is. Materialism, for example, would be a very common one. The problem is people don't perceive these as dogmas, and so they go completely unchallenged, and then they're just treated as if they're just, well, that's just true. And because of that, I think that the modern secular, supposedly skeptical person is actually one of the most dogmatic, doctrinaire, close-minded creatures that has ever been produced by the human race. We are some of the most close-minded, arrogant fuckfaces that have ever lived. We are so dismissive. We are so self-centered and so like, what would you say? So eager to listen to authority figures, and I don't mean that like in a political sense, but in like a, how many times will you, if anyone listening to this is stupid enough to argue on the internet, how many times do you argue with someone, they're like, well, I found a study that says this. End of debate. Never mind that when it comes to social psychology, there's a huge replication crisis, and we're basically finding that many of the psychological studies, the Zimbardo prison experiment, the Milgram experiment, these very famous experiments can't be repeated in modern times. Things that we based entire, what was it, the psychologist Daniel Kahneman, who, his work was
slow, right?
Yes. And but in the past number of years, he's come out and said, well, many of my findings may have been somewhat overwrought in how people have taken them as gospel, and we may have made some mistakes. And so I think it's as essential as ever that people take the path of the free spirit. And what I mean by that is actually being aware of when you're following something that is like a moral dogma or a pseudo-religious dogma almost, that you've just taken as like a secular, like, oh, that's just true, right? That to me is what needs to be challenged. We need to learn our own, understand our own, recognize our own, the way that we are bound within a certain conceptual framework, within a certain lexicon of terms and categories that we've created for understanding the world. As long as we don't see that that even exists, and we think, well, I'm just interfacing with reality and I just believe the truth, you're like the worst religious dogmatist that's ever lived. At least an evangelical Christian, when you talk to them in modern times, because they're so aware of how separate their beliefs are from everyone else. I had a friend who was a Calvinist, a Baptist Calvinist in high school. And, he would say like, well, I would ask him questions about things like moral issues. Like, what do you think? Because he's sort of an oddity, right? And he would say, well, speaking as a Calvinist, and that phrase, well, speaking as a Calvinist, it signifies an awareness of I'm operating within this conceptual framework that you may not hold. How often do you hear people say speaking like a secular materialist atheist, and so that's what I think we need. That would be a start, an awareness of the fact that the things you believe, and we could get into, people, I'm sure there's somebody screaming at the screen now listening to this who thinks, well, no, this is proven by scientific data. Okay, well, we could have a long conversation about what science is and how it works and how you don't prove things, you falsify things. But that should give you more humility. It shouldn't make you more of a dogmatist. And that's what I think our worldview has done.
Do you think it's possible to hold kind of opposite views, for example, to be simultaneously a materialist and an idealist? Or not to be, but, to understand both positions to the level when you can actually communicate with somebody who doesn't share your views. And
I like to think I can do that. I probably can't do it as well as I think I can. But I think there's nothing like philosophy for developing that skill. So long as you actually read widely and read people from different cultures and different eras is the other thing too. Because you'll see that this world of abstract thought binds the whole human race together in many respects, but also that when you read from people speaking in different eras and different cultures, they have perspectives on things. The things that are obvious to you are not necessarily obvious to everyone else. And that is where, to me, the great insights are about like comparative philosophy, is seeing, what were the problems of Western philosophy, right? So Western philosophy for a long time, like you said, materialism, idealism, so concerned with this epistemological question. How do we know what we know? This distance between the senses and the true world. Whereas if you look at like Chinese philosophy, that question isn't really there in among the Chinese philosophers. I mean, maybe to some extent, you could say with Buddhism, it kind of comes in, but like pre-Buddhist Chinese philosophy, they're concerned with like order and disorder, or chaos or harmony. That's what the philosopher does, is brings that forth. But also, the entire way that they conceive of the world and the individual. They don't have like the concept in, say, Taoist philosophy of the soul, of this like core to the what would you say, essential core to the human being, that without which you would not be what you are, right? That's what we in the West have had historically, that there is this thing called the soul, and without that you would not be what you are. You could lose a limb, you could have the body altered in all sorts of ways, but it's the soul that is truly who you are, independent of where you're from or any of these other things. Whereas in Chinese philosophy, they're concerned with the individual is just this sort of like emergent property of all these patterns and humors and forces and elements within the body.
It's some kind of process ontology, right? So there's nothing like Platonic forms. There's just a constant change. And we can't actually use language to describe certain entities which exist forever. But and even like Nietzsche, recently I was reading, I guess it was 16 or 17 paragraph of the 16 or 17 paragraph of the first chapter, and he talks about this idea of will and the idea of I.
In which book?
Beyond Good and Evil.
Beyond Good and Evil.
Yeah, and he basically says that this idea of, first of all, I think, well, it may like for when Decartes says that it's obvious, like for me, that I think, or what is I, like what is think? There's so many elements which we can reduce, like not reduce, but divide this concept like I, and it's when you think about the world, like about the words and language itself, not as something real, but as a tool to describe what's going on. But again, you have to keep this awareness that it's simply a tool, that it doesn't like it may correspond to certain things in the world, but as soon as you start believing that language basically is real in a sense as the real world is real, here's when everything comes to the point when you develop ideologies, when you develop certain dogmas, when you develop certain frame of thinking, which make you a bounded spirit, or bound spirit.
I'm really glad you brought up Descartes and that passage by Nietzsche, because I think that actually ties together everything we've just talked about so far. Descartes, I think what Nietzsche points out there, he's like, I think is not an immediate certainty the way Descartes says. He says, at any rate, that he says the philosopher of the future will say, at any rate, none of this is an immediate certainty for me. And he gives a bunch of reasons for this. He's like, how could you know what thinking is unless you compare it to some other state, which you also know what it is? How do you know that what you're talking about is not perhaps willing or feeling? You know, how do you even propose that there's an I that thinks, as we said, that you see that you may not know that that's an assumption until you look at a whole tradition of philosophy where that's not an assumption, right? And then you realize, oh, that's something I'm assuming. So what Descartes did, and he says in his letter addressed to the faculty of Sorbonne in the preface, the whole point of the meditations is to prove the existence of the immortal soul to the infidel. And so where people look at Descartes and they say, Descartes was the first Enlightenment philosopher, or one of the first, and he, you know, Schopenhauer says he taught men to use their minds where Aristotle or the church had, or the Bible had been used in the past. And so that is a way that Descartes did innovate. But what I think Descartes did mostly was take the theological doctrine of the immortal soul and transfer it to secular idea of ego consciousness, put it into abstract philosophical terms, maybe under the intuition that it'd be easier to convince people of the mortal soul, to convince the infidel of the immortal soul, if you don't just throw the Bible at them and make an argument. It's actually very, it's a brilliant way to proselytize your religion. But what's happened there? Descartes took an assumption from his old conceptual lexicon, and he just put it into new language and then said, I've proved it, when really what he did was just recapitulate to the same view of the self that the church had. And that's what I would say we're doing in the modern era all the time. We're taking all of these things, we're doing the exact same thing Descartes did. We're taking things like pity and the universal brotherhood of man and all these Christian values and treating them as if they're objective facts of secular morality. And now we have these ideas like moral realism, that there are moral facts that you can discover, as if you could have a science of morality. And like, what are you going to measure moral facts? Are you going to run experiments on them? I mean, all the moral experiments we have, what are they really? Thought experiments? That's just getting people to tell you what they agree with. That doesn't actually prove that there's a moral fact out there independent of the human mind. But so I don't know. I'll stop bashing on analytic philosophy, but that's because it's not all bad. It's really not. But I think that Descartes is the perfect example of how we launder assumptions of our previous cultural lexicons into modern language.
Yeah, in one of the later paragraphs, he uses a Schopenhauerian idea of will and basically says the same about this idea. So Schopenhauer claims that the will is something that fundamentally known to us from kind of inner intuition, following Kant's ideas of a priori and pure understanding. And Nietzsche again takes this idea of will and separates in many parts, showing how, like, even in this act of willing, there's two forces, right? One is kind of commanding force, another is obeying. So in us, like, you have both. You can't just be an absolute commander. So you have, and this idea, when I was reading it, I started thinking about this dichotomy between master and slave morality, And I started realizing that it's not so simple that there's two types morality and they apply to individuals in the world outside. It's like also about your own parts of this willing thing. So if you denounce slave morality, you denounce something in yourself, which is like you become
that obeys, right?
Yeah. This part becomes weaker, and finally, all sorts of consequences may follow from it.
I think that's also a huge problem for the individualist and like libertarian reading of Nietzsche, because there are people who read Nietzsche and say, well, I should be this free-spirited master who's independent from all society. Now, it's complicated, but I wouldn't like deny that that's like part of what Nietzsche is encouraging to some extent. But there's also passages, there's many passages where he brings this up and says that part of the weakness of modern man is that we no longer want to command and we no longer want to obey. And that we no longer actually understand ourselves as fitting into this order of rank, right? And so it's not all about Nietzsche just saying like, oh, I want to be this higher man who's above all of you. I think he legitimately believes that in human interaction, there should be some sort of hierarchy, that's how functional human structures actually work. And that requires, it's like that he's almost advocating for a morality in which the vast majority of people will have to obey. And that includes people like Nietzsche. He knows that philosophers, they don't rule society, in spite of what Plato's Republic might dream about. Unless you want to live like Diogenes, right? The philosopher is also, he's not the commander of society, and he's typically not living completely outside of society. There's also passages in Thus Spoke Zarathustra on the voluntary death and on war and warriors. He basically talks very with praise of throwing your life away and squandering a great soul for a cause beyond yourself. And so none of that seems to me to fit with like a purely individualist reading of Nietzsche, because he's very aware that we don't just live as these disconnected individuals. A lot of his project is a cultural project. That's what he starts out. He has his first book, Birth of Tragedy, but it is philosophy, but that book is like nested within like philology and classicism and study of classical antiquity, where he really starts to philosophize. Independent from that is the Untimely Meditations. What are the Untimely Meditations? It's a series of cultural criticisms where he's worried about the state of the German culture and where we're going as a society. That's not somebody who's just like, I don't care about the rest of the world, I'm just going to be an individual. He's concerned with, again, what we're talking about, this collective net of consciousness, this lexicon that guides all of our lives. And so this idea that ultimately it should just be about self-centeredness, I don't think that's right. I think, and as you say, it even applies to the own individual with the understanding of drives and this theory of the self as not a unity, but a multiplicity. That is not just, that's a huge problem for individualism too, because it's saying you're not individual as in non-divided, or cannot be divided into two, is how we break down the word individual. Dividual,
I guess
dual.
I guess he speaks about atomism of the soul also, like atom, like an individual is not an atom,
right? Yeah, the smallest quanta of matter of the soul that you find, or whatever, where really he's saying the way he describes the psyche or the soul seems to me to be akin to almost like, you could call it, if you
social
wanted to use a pun,
social structure of souls.
I was going to say a state of mind. There's kind of a double entendre there, a literal state, a nation state of mind, but that there's an emergent state that is produced from all of these drives. So yeah,
I remember 2012 I was working on my dissertation, and in it I was comparing the state with an individual. And basically,
Okay.
the dissertation was on the state of the law. There's a concept of, in German, right state, like the state of right. And I try to understand, like, I try to understand it, comparing an individual, like taking an individual like a state, and considering all different like nations which existed prior to World War I as like 10, 15, 20 individuals just who interact with each other, and what kind of what kind of motives they are pursuing. For example, Germany was kind of athlete who just who does only some working out all the time, and some other states like they focus on the intellect. And it's an interesting comparison. Then you kind of project it back and try to think about yourself as like different, like a state with different motives, with different drives.
Yeah, what would the nation state of me look like if it was like rendered into, if my soul was made into a whole community? That's a really interesting question, and that seems almost like a good like writing prompt for anyone to do. But yeah, I remember when you were talking about Germany as the athlete that's just concerned with this. When Nietzsche went to university, he joined a fraternity at first, and was very much trying to I guess go around and be like, brothers, let's revivify the German culture. And he found that all of the frat brothers were just sort of, he called it the simple beer drinking patriotism that he despised was what dominated their minds. So he was very disappointed in that. But yeah, and especially with World War I, what's interesting about that, I mean, as many people probably know, I mean, three of the leaders of the main belligerent nations were first cousins during World War I. I believe Britain, Russia, and I think the Kaiser were all related, because of the systems of nobility that governed Europe. And I mean, Nietzsche himself criticizes in the late 1800s this sort of like old decaying dynastic interests. He perceives that that's going away. But I think he has sort of, I mean, there's a reason why he's called a reactionary, because he has a critique of like the democratizing of society and the egalitarian push in society and the socialist movements that were becoming very popular, that he thinks the only functional way that we found to organize human beings is this hierarchical structure that literally is, a pyramid where it ends in one person. And that's, that's what he sees as, like, if you were to say, what would an actual individual look like in the state of mind? It would be an ordered hierarchy like that, where all the drives are sublimated to the one goal. And so through democracy or egalitarianism, he's basically saying we're going to sort of like botch all of our states. And there's an interesting thing he says with sort of the macrocosmic comparison between the state and the individual, where he's talking about the masses or the rabble. And he says, notice I did not say a mass of individuals. That basically most people in modern society aren't capable of being individuals, because they don't have any coherent ordering structure for all of their drives. They just sort of go in different hedonic directions. They follow what's told to them and pursue short-term pleasures and all these things. He doesn't think any of that adds up to being an individual. And so, yeah, I don't know. I don't know if I can really, I don't know if there's much we can take from that in modern times for our own, like for practical use of like what we would do with that, other than just the fact that I think he thinks it's really essential that you have something that is beyond yourself that you're trying to move towards. And that could even be like the overman idea. There's an ideal vision of me, of the human being, that I want to proceed towards. And that's kind of what he thinks is missing. And that's what, whether you love this idea or hate it, and many people hate it, Nietzsche thinks the king or the monarch is sort of that, like the ideal ruling, orienting force that is beyond yourself that you should be willing to sacrifice to and obey. And that's why, what was it, Jorgis, I don't know how to pronounce his name, Brandes, the Danish fellow who's Nietzsche's friend, said he described Nietzsche's political philosophy as aristocratic radicalism. And Nietzsche said, that's the best description I've ever heard of my political ideas. And so, yeah.
So this idea, having something beyond your own, like it's definitely kind of metaphysical idea, right? And Nietzsche is well known for criticizing all metaphysical ideas. Like let's try to discuss metaphysics. Like what's wrong with metaphysics according to Nietzsche? And
so I think the best, I'm not going to say anything specifically from Nietzsche with my
there's some problems with
maybe
connection.
like initial
how
did I
yeah,
okay, I saw you first. I'll start again. Yeah, so without quoting anything specifically from Nietzsche, I'll put it in sort of a paraphrastic way that I think gets it across. So metaphysics means first philosophy, or well, it actually means before physics. It was I believe we get the term from Aristotle's works, where he has a section on physics, and then there's a section for which the title I think is lost, but it's the section before physics. But typically they call it first philosophy, which means, in more modern terms, epistemology and ontology. Basically, how do we know what we know? What is the character of reality? And that's first philosophy, because you should determine this before you start making moral or political claims, right? Because if you don't even know what reality is, how can you make a moral claim about reality? That's sort of the traditional thinking. I think Nietzsche's, like, to put it in a sentence, what his problem with metaphysics is no metaphysics has ever successfully gotten us there and told us what reality is and allowed us to have valid knowledge that we can actually say, we know how we know this and we know it for sure. That's never happened in all of philosophy. And so why not skip the first philosophy and start with philosophy that's relevant to your own life, that's relevant to what's going on around you. And that's what morality is. Like, it shouldn't be this abstract concern. It's, how do I act in the world? What's valuable to me? What should I value? What should others value? And so on and so forth. Nietzsche is saying, I think, so on a very like just basic level, he's saying all of that stuff in metaphysics remains in the abstract. We've never been able to bring it from the abstract into the concrete. Meanwhile, all the stuff in morality and politics, that's going to go on whether you philosophized about it or not. And to maybe, I'll take something Kant said. So Kant said, everyone, I'm paraphrasing because I don't remember exactly, but he said, every man will have metaphysics and will do metaphysical speculation. If there is not some absolute standard for how to go about it, he'll simply do it according to his own fashion. And for Kant, that's the big problem. We need to have some universal absolute standard of metaphysics. I think what Nietzsche might be saying is, people are all they're all living out a moral philosophy or a political ethos or a set of cultural assumptions, whether or not you do philosophy about it or not, right? That's all ongoing. So we can either bring in philosophical insight and self-reflection to those areas, even though we can't say that we know for sure what reality is, or we can't say that we know how the senses whether our senses actually correspond to a true world or not. To Nietzsche saying, okay, I mean, in a way, this all probably sounds kind of old hat, right, to a lot of people now, because that's how what I just described is probably like a very like what a person's dismissive attitude about philosophy might be if they're not philosophical. They'd be like, that's just a bunch of abstract jerking off, and I need to pay my bills and get things done in the real world. I mean, so that's what I would say is first and foremost is Nietzsche saying we don't ever this abstract stuff. And Schopenhauer is a perfect example. Schopenhauer is somebody who so thoroughly embraced the metaphysics of Kant and the Kantian divide between phenomena and noumenon. And his book is really quite brilliant as an act of transcendental idealism of trying to bridge that gap. And he does it in sort of a very brilliant way, but it's kind of brilliant in the way that it's like a trick, right? And Nietzsche was aware that it was a trick. That it's like, you didn't actually discover the inner character of the world. You discovered the inner character of you and your own psychology, which doesn't necessarily tell us about any of that. And so I think that was Nietzsche's perception, that all ontological claims are ultimately going to devolve to somebody's perspective. And so Nietzsche's radical move is like, okay, let's just embrace that then. It's all just my perspective. But from my perspective, I still need things. I still value things. I still want things. We still have like a broader collective net, cultural, conceptual, conscious net of language. We have to exist and live. And so that's where his philosophical energy was to be put forward. And so that's what I would say. That's his rejection, is basically saying, I mean, I talked about it in the first episode of the podcast, but we got rid of the imaginary world along with the true one. Let's the true world no longer has any meaning for us. Let's abolish it.
Yeah, it looks it looks very similar to the project of Socrates. Right, before Socrates, there were all these thinkers, pre-Socratics, who were concerned with, what is the matter, what is the universe, what is it made of, and then after Socrates, we see this shift to moral philosophy, basically analyze. But again, it's not purely moral philosophy, but people started talking about, what's good, what's bad. Right, before they're talking
how to live.
Yeah, how to live, what to do, and and they took a different approach to like who we are, right? Before it was like we're a bunch of whatever matter. Now we're pure souls.
Yeah, the secret of the relationship between Nietzsche and Socrates is that they're the same person. I mean, and so whenever I remember seeing a video that would just, because on YouTube you have to like, if you want to get views, you have to like put things in all caps and clickbait titles and stuff. And I just remember seeing this screen, the thumbnails like, why Nietzsche hated Socrates in huge letters. And it just, things like that just make me sick, man, where I'm like, how can you be so wrong? Like, and it's because you don't really understand that it's like one of his most informative passages about Socrates is in The Birth of the Tragedy. I'm actually going to talk about this in the podcast in more depth soon. But he talks about the theoretical man and how Socrates is like the beginning of the theoretical approach to life, and then Faust is the end. It's like the alpha and the omega. And his reason for this is basically like, for Socrates, knowledge is still like a promise. It's like the way to the good life. It's like we can discover how to live through knowledge. He says this too in his pre-Platonic lectures, where he says, in all other philosophers, life served knowledge, but for Socrates, knowledge serves life. Now, it's a very different thing that he said about Socrates when he's talking about the Apology, because Socrates seemingly dies for knowledge in the Apology. He like sacrifices himself for philosophy. So what is he talking about there? Well, in his pre-Platonic lectures, what he's talking about is that Socrates' one concern throughout everything he's doing is how to live virtuously. It's where everything ends up. I just did a 2-part series on the Symposium. They're all talking about love, and then when it comes time for Socrates to talk about love, his conclusion is that to truly love is to be a philosopher, because discovering wisdom is wisdom's the most beautiful thing, because wisdom gives rise to the greatest good. What's the greatest good? Virtue. So Socrates is like, well, true love is going and being a philosopher who teaches other people how to be virtuous. That's the highest form of love. So it's kind of funny because it's like Socrates always says, well, the way I live my life is really the answer to basically everything. What are we talking about? Ice cream? It's actually about virtue. Are we talking about love? It's actually about philosophy finding virtue. We talking about rocket ships? No, that really, you need to do philosophy to learn how to be virtuous. That's the first step to building a rocket ship. So it's like, that's his answer for everything. But that's why Nietzsche says in philosophy, he's the first Lebensphilosoph, or philosopher of life, because his philosophy is like a life philosophy. And I guess really the point, there's still a criticism in there because Socrates is at the beginning, right? So he's perhaps naively optimistic about what knowledge can do because man has not lived a life of knowledge. Nietzsche compares this to Faust in Goethe's play. For those who don't know, Dr. Faustus is he wishes to experience.
Yeah.
Pact with the devil. Mm-hmm. Well, he wants to reach the zenith of human happiness and knowledge. What is the most basically enlightenment? He's like, can I be enlightened on earth? Live this eudaimon life where I'm living in knowledge and virtue and wisdom. And he believes that it can't ever be reached. But the way Nietzsche describes him is he's like, I'm trying to remember the phrasing, I'll paraphrase, where he says, Faust tearing through every discipline, looking for the scrap of happiness and knowledge. Faust searching for some shore of rest on the wide ocean of inquiry. And so it's like, he basically sees Faust as like sort of the problem of the modern man is like, for Socrates, knowledge was a promise of something to come. Faust is like, oh, where has this taken me? This project of living the examined life has taken me to doing a deal with the devil in order to find some rest from my endless searching for knowledge. And I think Nietzsche sees himself, I think in a way, those two characters are like, they're like a yin and yang. And Nietzsche he associates himself with Socrates, yes, but he's sort of like, I think he wanted to be like a philosophical, like a real life philosophical Faust. Basically showing you these are the limits of knowledge, of the knowledge, the life lived in the service of knowledge that Socrates began. But it's not because he like hates Socrates. It's because in a way he is Socrates, as you pointed out. He criticizes many of the same things that Socrates does, and his assessment of the problem of Socrates in Twilight of Idols, I mean, he could be talking about Nietzsche. He's saying this man arises during a decadent age, but he doesn't halt the decadent age by attacking all of the morals and culture of society. He actually hastens it. And that's exactly what Nietzsche does. And so I hope that was all coherent of explaining
there's some sense that when I read Nietzsche and he discusses certain philosophers, he discusses it as if he was them, kind of from their perspective, and as if they were one of his impulses, which he analyzed like to a degree where he could understand like what was wrong with them, and he may just simply describe in his own terms, like kind of rejecting certain impulse within himself through rejecting certain philosopher. Or not necessarily rejecting, but just
recognizing that this cannot be the totalizing drive behind everything.
Yeah. Also know that Socrates kind of laid down the foundation for cynicism, and Diogenes. He was like not a follower of Socrates, but he tried to live a kind of life which.
Plato said he was Diogenes as a Socrates gone mad. So,
and we know Nietzsche also praised cynicism in some of his works. If I remember correctly, he said that cynicism is the highest virtue which is attainable on earth. Can we talk about it a little bit?
There's another passage in Ecce Homo where he says cynicism is one of the only ways by which mean souls touch honesty.
Mm-hmm.
And so the word mean in English means, so we would use it today to refer to like a rude, brash person, but it also means common or vulgar or a thing of the masses. And we still carry that meaning today.
There's a golden mean in Aristotle.
Yes, because mean, so the word mean still means the
Middle.
average, the middle. So the average type of person, the mean person. It's I mean, this kind of etymology is really one of Nietzsche's great contributions to philosophy and to philology, as in genealogy and morality, by pointing out how all the things that we call bad generally have a link etymologically with common, and the things we call good, like when you say that was a very noble thing you did. Yeah. But in any case, so when he's talking about mean souls, there's a thing he says in I believe Beyond Good and Evil, that honesty is sort of like the purview of the noble soul, right? True honesty, because that true honesty is your words, your deeds following your words straightforwardly. So you say, I'm going to do this, and then you do it. And that is even in, I think, certain like tribal societies today, we see this concept of honesty as sort of correlated with power in a way. Let's see. Okay, it froze for a second. Okay, cool. So I think what he's saying there with that passage in Neke Homo is that cynicism, in the sense that we might think of like a stand-up comedian, which is like comedy has always been like a working man's art form, in contrast to tragedy, which was for the nobility. But Nietzsche is a comedian in many ways. He's a very funny philosopher. And so for all of his praise of tragedy, Nietzsche recognizes basically the cynical sort of deconstruction or incisive critique of society, of the court jester or of the working man's comedian, is the way that most people are able to have access to like an honest understanding of society, which is to say, understanding how the power structure really works, and cutting through all of the moral bullshit that we talk about. And so I think, in general terms, that's what he sees as the power of cynicism. I don't know if I can bring to mind where he says it's the highest virtue, but the interesting thing about when Nietzsche talks about virtues is he says that so this may relate to this. He says that all of our virtues are best when they are not universalized but personal, and that our greatest virtues will often be unknown except to ourselves. There may not even be a word for your virtue, your specific kind of virtue, in the general lexicon, because it's only yours. That's like the real. And so I think Nietzsche may have, again, been talking about himself, that he realizes he's sort of a cynical. I talked about this with Carl on my podcast in one of the conversations, where he brought up a passage from Ecce Homo where Nietzsche said, I do not want to be a priest. I would rather be a clown. Maybe I am a clown. And that he realizes he's sort of a cynical comedian in a sense. And there are a lot of things that people take very seriously in Nietzsche, like the Zarathustra's prologue with the tightrope walker. That's a very funny scene. It's I think an intended element of comedy there, that, you know, when the tightrope walker goes out and then the jester leaps over him and he falls to his death, and then Zarathustra says, I'll bury you with my own hands, and then he just forgets about it and leaves the man's corpse in a tree. You know, all these things, like and so yeah, that would be my answer. I think cynicism, it's a virtue for Nietzsche because it cuts through our ornamentation on the reality of power. And it's the way mean souls touch honesty, because everyone has access to it. And comedy is sort of comedy's always been the common form of art, and the way that the common person, the mean person, gains insight, philosophical insight.
It's strange to see, like, for example, when we discuss cynicism, like for many people, at least for those whom I communicate with, cynicism seems to be kind of very nasty thing. They believe that cynicism is something, you know, you're almost like a misanthrope.
Yeah.
Like a person who hates other people. But at the same time, when we read Greek philosophers, like most of them praise cynicism, and they say that cynicism, it's like a certain way of living when you basically disregard wealth, when you disregard power, authority, when you just when you are like a dog, right? The cynic was like kina was the word for a dog.
Yeah, well, that's Diogenes saying that, he doesn't understand all of our, like in his day, this is a perfect example, actually, because people like to talk about how Diogenes would like masturbate in public and say, would that I could sate my hunger merely by patting my belly.
Yeah.
But I think a great example is how he would eat in the forum. And people are like, well, what's the problem with that? And it's like, exactly. In his culture, it was very rude to eat in the forum. To all of us, that doesn't seem like, if you were out in the public square and you eat a sandwich, you don't think that's rude.
Yeah.
Diogenes sees the same thing that you do, only it's like, it's very easy for us to see because we don't live in that culture. And so that's what there's another famous phrase attributed to Diogenes that I think is it might be apocryphal, but he's talking to another philosopher where he says, you mistake the fruit for the painting of you mistake the fig that you can eat for a painting of it, or something like that. I'm probably butchering it, but that's mostly, like, I think why he sets the mold for the cynical outlook is that he attacks all of these ornamentations and things that he sees as clearly not true or not natural. Natural is probably a better word. They're just ersatz, they're added on. And they're not universal. And that's what cynicism allows you to see. That's the honesty of cynicism. I think why a lot of people have a negative view of it, and what I would say, under a certain definition of the term cynicism, I view of it in that I don't like reflexive dismissiveness.
You freezed when you said when you.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah,
one of the reasons I don't like cynicism is because depending on how you define the word, I don't like reflexive dismissiveness. People just like, oh no, that's bullshit. I think being skeptical and what would you say, being aware of the realities of power is very important and very powerful in and of itself. I think because the term could have multiple definitions or multiple uses, a lot of times people use cynicism to mean like pessimism, or to mean just sort of just being like
some sort of meanness, right? In terms of,
right, or detached ironic coolness. I don't even care. And that, I think, is like very weak. It's not. It's just retreating from all the problems of the world. Adam Curtis talks about this in his documentaries a lot, if you're familiar with him, but he makes a lot of critique of the counterculture in America, because he talks about how in the 60s they dreamed of changing the world through revolution, but then all that got channeled into art and music and cultural expression. And he talks about the singer Patti Smith in one of his movies, Hypernormalization. And he shows all these clips of her where they're following her through New York in 1975. New York in 1975 was falling apart. I mean, the city was fiscally insolvent. They were going bankrupt. All the welfare was collapsing. There was gangs fighting, running wars, burning down buildings for the insurance money. It was a nightmare. When people flew into New York in 1975, at the airport, they gave you a little card with a skull and crossbones on it that said, "Welcome to Fear City." And on the back, it had a list of tips of what not to do, or what to do. Don't walk alone at past 7 p.m. and don't get into an unmarked taxi. It was basically, they scared the shit out of people when they came to New York. But he talks about how Patti Smith, she had been part of all these radical hippie movements. Then she just starts to watch the city fall apart with a detached, ironic coolness. And she's just sort of like walking around being like, oh, look at all that graffiti. It's so cool. And, I think that's cooler than a lot of art sometimes, is when, these kids write graffiti all over the walls. And I remember when I saw that, I was like, wow, that's so many of my friends. They're just like, and people on social media, they're like, oh, world's going to hell. Fuck it, man. And I don't know if I can come up with a good term to distinguish that from cynicism, the kind of cynicism that I like. That's where, you hear somebody say a bunch of moralistic bullshit. Let's say on foreign policy, with everything on foreign policy that's going on in, like, say, Russia and Ukraine right now, you'll hear all these moral arguments. Really, we all know foreign policy is still the state of nature. Might makes right, and nation states have goals, and then they will do those goals if they have the power to do it.
Mm-hmm.
It's as simple as that. There's no international law. That's a lie. I mean, there's international law insofar as nations live under the umbrella of certain empires, and then that empire imposes an international law on them. But power is what backs it up. And so that kind of cynicism of just saying, I don't believe all your moral explanations, power is the reality. I like that. I don't like the kind that's just sort of like, oh, I don't care, and I'm above this, and I'm just going to watch the world burn around me. That to me sounds like just nihilism. Maybe that's the word I would use for.
Yeah, by the way, nihilism is another central concept in Nietzsche, and I think it's a good transition from cynicism to nihilism. Can we discuss nihilism now? For me, let me just try to wrap my head around the idea. Like, I've read lots of Russian, classic writers, and like it's in 60s, 80s, 60s, 80s, 70s. I guess this is the time when the concept was developed, and mostly it was developed as there was this guy Turgenev. He wrote the book Fathers and Sons, and in this book, the main character of this book, Bazarov, he was a kind of caricature on a real writer, Dobrolubov. And Dobrolubov, he was kind of social, like some sort of pre-social democrat who tried to like show certain ways for. Like, he tried basically to advocate for abolition of slavery, and he tried to attack power figures, try to reinterpret all cultural heritage which we had, and he was brilliant in writing. Here, basically, he died at the age of 26, and for 5 years, like for the last 5 years of his life, he was basically writing all the time, and he influenced a lot of movements, not only literature but also outside of literature. And when Turgenev published his book, most of again, there was progressives and there was conservatives. In Russia, they were just Slavophiles and Westerners, and some people took it as oh, this is our young generation, and they are all like mistaken. They don't understand what they are doing. They try to destroy the social order, etc. And for the other side, it was like, oh, this is this is the real character. It's not simply denying all this order, but it's trying to to live as a free spirit, to try to understand what we can do, and to try to get rid of all elements which no longer work in our society. And so, and there was this term nihilism. It referred to certain generation, certain movement in society, and in reality, it wasn't nihilism. It was it was actually realism. So the word which they used among themselves didn't call. It's like now when we call somebody modernist, lots of postmodernists, they deny that I'm not a postmodernist like Foucault or French philosophers. They do not consider themselves to be postmodernists. It's kind of pejorative name. And the same for Russian nihilists. It was pejorative to call somebody nihilist, and they prefer to call themselves realists. Mm. And it's it seems most of them were anti, Leo Tolstoy, for example, later when he became preoccupied with Christianity, and when he wrote his non-fictional works, like What is the Art?
That's one of my favorite essays of all time.
Mm-hmm.
It's hugely inspirational to me.
Yeah, he basically wrote in this essay that all this art, it's we try to entertain the upper class, and we dismiss everything what's going on on a social level. And one of the idea which moved him, it was the idea developed by Pisarev, and it was another, like, the guy who basically after Dobrolubov, he took his role as social critic and as a literature critic, and he was almost, if we consider Nietzsche immoralist, like the guy who criticized morality, but it's also a type of moralism. But anyway, this guy, he was anti-aesthetician, if I may use such a term. Like he was famous for criticizing aesthetics and art, and Leo Tolstoy basically took his ideas to the extreme. But the media which exist at that time, they called it not like realism or anti-aestheticism, they called it like a nihilism. So they tried to deny all orders, they try to deny what's going on in government, they try to basically say that nothing makes any sense, let's get rid of religion, let's get rid of everything. So it's very controversial. And and later, like, nihilism, what is like known now, for me it's kind of mystery, because it's almost like cynicism. Some people believe that they understand what is cynicism, but there are so many versions of cynicism, and with nihilism it seems to be like very close. Like, for me, nihilism, I wouldn't call it something bad. There's certain movements which what do you call it? Like, certain movements which were nihilistic, and they still brought lots of positive influence on what was going on in our society, in our not just social life, but cultural life, and language and science, maybe, and philosophy and psychology.
There's something Nietzsche does quite a bit. He does it with pessimism. He does it with nihilism, where he'll take a word and say, so with nihilism, for example, in Will to Power, he says, well, there's active nihilism and then there's passive nihilism. He also pessimism. He says there's a pessimism of strength and pessimism of weakness. And so this is his way, I think, of getting out of the quandary of the multiple uses of many of these terms. He recognizes that there is a sense in which you could talk about one of these. Like, he tries to find what it is underlying these terms, which, again, these are all relative, just conceptual frameworks. So the word itself is not important. He's wondering, what is the instinct driving you? And so with the Russian nihilists, as you're talking about, I can't remember the name of the author. It might have been the fellow you were talking about who died when he was 26. There's a scene in a fictional work where it's like the father talking to his kids. And they say, well, we must do what is useful or most expedient to us. And what's expedient today is to repudiate everything. And the father's like, everything? They say, everything. And that is a very Russian idea, but it's not nihilistic in the sense of Nietzsche would talk about passive nihilism. That's a very active, destructive, it's destruction that can then therefore like clear the ground so something new can arise.
Yeah, it's like destructions for destruction. Yeah, there was in the passage when Pisarev said, like, destroy everything what survives. What will survive is good. What will not survive, we shouldn't care about.
Yeah, it's like a tempering process, or a culling process, basically. I think so I think that in some sense, that is very useful to think about when evaluating, like, just calling something nihilism doesn't really matter. What Nietzsche is wondering about is, what is it underneath it that you're fundamentally aimed at or trying to bring forth? And so an important thing to remember as well, and this is a big problem for the Jordan Peterson interpretation of Nietzsche. Jordan Peterson sort of sees the antidote to nihilism to be a return to Christian values. If you read Nietzsche, he says Christianity is nihilism. That's the problem with Christianity, is that it is a Trojan horse for nihilism, basically. And so the way Nietzsche conceives of nihilism is somewhat counterintuitive, because in many respects, the people who go around repudiating everything, I think he thinks, can be very active, vigorous, vital souls. Whereas the people who just accept these received wisdom, they're often very passive. And if it's something like Christianity that they're receiving, Christianity, I mean, the reason why he calls it nihilistic is because obviously it divests our world of all value and places it into an other world. That's really, and I've beaten this issue to death on my podcast, but that's really is the central issue. I mean, the others are like pity. It's all the variation on the same theme of making any value in your life and in your accomplishments worthless, basically, in comparison, because all that matters is God's grace at the end of the day. All that matters is whether or not you accept Jesus and get to go to heaven. This isn't all a, the earth is just a moral battleground for this. It's a battle of the souls between God and Satan. And they're having a contest for who can get the most. In the end, it's going to burn away in fire. And nothing you have done here will have mattered, except insofar as the things you've done lead you to salvation or whatever. And so that's a problem for Nietzsche. I mean, the other issue would be like, soul over body, abstract moralism over physical expediency, all of these things that he thinks are like weak. But I mean, the other thing too, not to let the secular modern materialists off the hook, is that the last man concept, and thus spoke Zarathustra, is like the ultimate nihilist. And that's basically the idea that we should seek after contentment, and that life should be sort of measured by the relative existence of pleasure or pain within it, and self-preservation or preservation of the current order, rather than what we talked about earlier, something beyond yourself. And so the last man, I mean, what is it? He looks, he says, like what is a star? What is an ideal? What is a goal? And he blinks. That's what the constant refrain with the last man, that he's this empty vessel, basically, just a blinking moron. I don't know, but it's like how we've basically made ourselves spiritually dull. And so that's the thing, is like, that's again another laundering of Christianity into secular terms, and that's nihilism again, because what it is, here's another way of explaining it. Christianity starts from the idea that we came from this garden where there was perfect harmony and there was no pain and everything was provided for us. And we just lived eternally in the same state that we were in. That's Adam and Eve in the garden. The promise of heaven is like paradise. That's what they call it. It's a return to paradise. And that's another way that we talk about the Garden of Eden, return to the garden. We may have gotten rid of Christianity or be on the way. Christianity is on the way out as a lexicon and as a framework for engaging with reality. People are still obsessed with how do we get back to the garden? And to Nietzsche, that's nihilism. How do I get back to this state where I don't have to do anything and I can just be content and be the same forever? And contentment, the whole idea of contentment, probably what he would say the big problem with it is that that whole word is kind of a lie. I mean, maybe you can have it for some temporary amount of time, but happiness is found in movement and in trying to attain goals. Contentment is the idea of happiness frozen in time, like no movement, just happiness that just endures and you don't have to do anything about it. That's a fatal misunderstanding in his view, and it's why he thinks every joy wants there to be profound suffering. If you ever say yes to a single joy, you said yes to all your sufferings, and vice versa. It's the peaks and the valleys that define one another. You have happiness because you have times where you're not happy. Basically, Schopenhauer's whole critique of reality that it swings like a pendulum between pain and boredom. Nietzsche says, yes, it does. And that's why we can be happy for certain moments. The fact that it is temporary is why happiness exists. And so maybe I've gone kind of off of nihilism, but I think that that's what maybe the mistake of nihilism is, and why I would agree with you. I think it's kind of a smear on those Russians to call it nihilists in that sense, because really the people who wanted to preserve those old church institutions are the same kind of people who always want to say, the point of life is to get back to the garden and to get some rest. People who want to rest.
Getting back to the garden, while you were talking, I thought this idea, and it's clear in Schopenhauer when he talks about the state after death, comparing it with the state before life, and he says basically it's the same state. And try to remember what was before you was born. There was nothing. You didn't care about anything. This it's almost like this ideal state, and you'll get to this after death. So you shouldn't, this short period, which we call life, he says, it's basically not important. It's just an illusion, like some Christian model of Christian idea that there's life is sin and misery, and you have to think about the heaven. You have to think about something beyond the same idea. And it's interesting to think about, like, Nietzsche still, like, he basically says that life, what is here, what we experience, this is the all there is. There's nothing like whatever happened before life and whatever will happen after death. It's nothing. You can't even say anything about it. And what we have to pay attention is our human experience, whatever is going on in our lives. And nihilism from this point, like, it's you disregard this. You can live in denial. You say it doesn't matter. What's matter is, like, it's not life, it's death. It's non-experience. It's not acting, not doing anything.
Yeah, well, one other thing Schopenhauer says too, it's at the very end of World as Will and Representation, where he says, oh, well, the secret goal of all religion is nothingness. It's it's the void. He thinks he's peeking under what all the religions, they tell you about a heaven or all these things to motivate people. But really what the truly wise person wants is
nothing,
a void.
Nothing. Yeah, it's
like
Buddhist nirvana, right? This
and he even says we should even reject Buddhist nirvana. We shouldn't even give it these fancy terms or whatever Eastern, which, I mean, part of that's just the fact that he's a Westerner and doesn't realize that nirvana in the original meaning more or less means extinguishment or extinction. It's like the term,
like the flame
term you'd use for a flame goes out. Exactly. So in the original Sanskrit, or in Pali rather, it wasn't ornamentation of the void. It was rather straightforward as well. But Nietzsche, so what you were saying, right, there's nothing beyond this life for Nietzsche. Well, and that's why, again, I think that has to do with the rejection of metaphysics, because it's like all the time that you're spending speculating about what it is that exists on either side of this brief moment of life that you have is time that you're not engaged with the questions that obtain while you're in this life. And that's why he wants this life to be eternal, or says we should wish for it to be eternal, with the eternal recurrence idea.
Recurrence, yeah. Can we touch on eternal recurrence a little bit? Like, I've actually, before we start, I listened to your last podcast when you discussed it, like the idea that life as it is, it just repeats over and over. Yeah, and Nietzsche, he calls it the heaviest, right? The heaviest thought. Like,
the greatest weight.
The tough, as you rephrase it, like the toughest challenge.
Toughest challenge.
Yeah. But at the same, I was thinking about it today, and I had this sense that, if we take it seriously, that the same life repeats over and over, it seems that there's no life. It's just basically like all reality is basically constant. There's no change, no motion, and we may say that, as like certain parts of it, it feels as if it's real. It feels as if you're doing something, but overall, if there's just repetition of the same thing, there's no change. It just stays the same all the time.
Yeah, that's certainly, a lot of people have that sense, and that I think, so there's two ways to look at it. One, and I think there's some truth to this, you could say that that's sort of a flaw in Nietzsche's idea, because it it does make it to where many of his other ideas, such as endless change or endless flux, or wanting to something beyond yourself, don't really happen. But the other side of that coin that Nietzsche might say is that, okay, whether or not your life leads to something greater that happens after you die, right? Like, let's say you do help bring forward the overman or something beyond yourself, you'll never know it anyway. Right? So that hasn't changed. The only thing you know or have direct experience with will be your own life anyway, would be maybe the rebuttal. Is like, you can't get out of that situation. It's just your life. And if there is some sort of metaphysical reality, we welcome to find anyone who has has some definitive proof about that. But until we do, as far as we know, it's just your life. And so that doesn't really change. That you only have whatever progress you make towards whatever goals you have or whatever ideals you have, that will only take place during your life anyway. I guess maybe, but I do see the flaw in it. I think what Nietzsche's rebuttal might be, and you can take it or leave it, would be, if you do feel weighted down by it, that's your own problem. That's your own weakness. Your life should be so awesome that thought would never even cross your mind, right? That you would take, what is it? Was that life? Well, then once more. That should be your attitude if you're a truly strong person. And if not, then the doctrine's not for you. It's not your medicine, it's your poison. And that's sort of like why I think Zarathustra struggles with it, is Nietzsche's own struggle of saying, this is going to be poison for a lot of people. But then it's like, he basically comes to the view, no, I have to, because of how this doctrine will, if fully accepted by the strong and the beautiful souls that exist out there, the truly higher people, when this is accepted, this will spiritualize life and glorify life to a degree that it's never been glorified before, right? And I guess I kind of explained it in that episode, but the reason why he goes for this idea, even though it seems to be problematic in some respects, is because he can't just accept, he doesn't want our life to be merely an instrumental tool towards something else. So no, it's not that your life is only valuable insofar as it gets you to heaven or nirvana, but he also doesn't want it to just be this thing, like Schopenhauer says, that you can just sort of like, just wait for death and it's fine. Like, oh, my life sucked, but death is coming, so that's cool. He wants it to be that your life is of infinite importance. And so this is the view. And as I discussed also in the episode, you can find people talking about some variation on the idea of eternal recurrence in world literature throughout the years. So it's not really his original idea. It's that I think he discovered that among other ideas and said, this is the one. And again, so we talked about he was against metaphysics, right? But he knows that all of these metaphysical positions are just our own perspective. And so he picks out a particular perspective out of all of them that he thinks will have the best effect for his goal, for what humanity is, and it's eternal recurrence. And so, in spite of all the flaws, I respect what he was trying to do. And I think it's actually, I've had the thought many times in my life, I think it's a worthwhile test for people to test themselves with. And I mean, I'm not trying to like brag or anything, but I've had those thoughts. I've had moments like that in my life where I have said, I would live my whole life over again, because
the same way.
The same way. My life has been amazing. I've said that multiple times. And, I think at one point Nietzsche says like, oh, most people won't even have this experience once. If somebody has it a couple times, what an amazing person. So thank you, Nietzsche. I thank you. I accept your praise. But it's why he talks about living dangerously. Build your cities in the slopes of Mount Vesuvius. Like that's one of those. It's unfortunate that line by Nietzsche, "Live dangerously," has become a cliche. Even though it originates with him, or like, what's the other one? That which doesn't kill me makes me stronger. Those things that have been taken and just run with by popular culture. But the reason why he writes those things, I think, is that's how you have those great moments in life where you say, it was all leading up to this point, or this is so incredible that this happened, or that I've experienced this. I would do it all over again, even if it does end. And that's the other thing about it, is like when he's talking about living dangerously in modern terms, with our self-preservative instinct as like one of our main orienting values for how we live, we say, well, laugh now, cry later. You're gonna, if you live dangerously and you don't have a plan for the future, you're gonna be really in a rough spot 30 or 40 years from now. We're always thinking about we're thinking about things like that like we sacrifice the great years that we have in exchange for having a little bit like not having as bad suffering at the end of our life, or all of these things.
To retire, like you have to work for 40 years, right? And then you may retire and leave. There's no life after you. Right. There is life, right? But it's not as probably as fulfilling as the life when you have at the age of 20 or 30 or 40, right? And like maybe it's even better from this perspective, just to like live as as rich life as you can live now. I mean, by rich, I mean like free. You don't need to bound yourself with certain certain things like family or work, or you may even put it off like to the older age if you really want to have something like that.
That's the sort of paradoxical relationship between eternal return and what we might call like momentism, or live in the now, that exists in Nietzsche. Like the Eckhart Tolle sort of idea that the past is gone and the future isn't here yet, because
it was developed it was developed fully by Gestalt psychology, like before Eckhart Tolle. Like I actually don't like Eckhart Tolle. I try to watch him, and whenever I watch him, it makes me like, Nietzsche. There is a passage when he says that certain ideas, even if you agree with them, if they're expressed by some person whom you don't like, you have to go against against your own.
It makes you suspicious of the idea then. Yeah. But I would just say that there's a big theme throughout Nietzsche of not sacrificing your happiness, your fulfillment, or what we might say. Don't sacrifice what's valuable to you now for something that is far away. Either like, there was somebody on the Nietzsche subreddit the other day who was saying, how can I, embrace my life and love my life when there's so much suffering in the world? It's like, well, one of Nietzsche's central insights is like, you are just taking on the suffering of the world and yourself. You're not helping them. All you're doing is adding to the sum total of people who think life is a problem by adding yourself to that. That's all you're doing. You're destroying your own happiness on account of the pain that's happening elsewhere. That's not actually happening to you. It doesn't have to happen to you. And likewise, we do that often in our own lives. So we say, I have to sacrifice what's valuable in my life now because of, I need to take care of my retirement and old age, or I shouldn't do something that unhealthy because I might die in early death, or something, this, that, and the other. I'm not saying you shouldn't take care of yourself, or you shouldn't plan for retirement, by the way. It's just being aware of the fact, and being aware of the ways in which we destroy the the happiness that we actually have in our own present experience, which is the only thing that exists for us at any given moment, for something that is far away and imagined and therefore abstract. And I think, even though that is an insight shared with like the live in the moment idea, part of the eternal recurrence is the idea of like, why would you waste any moment of your one eternal life that will repeat forever for why would you deaden it, flatten it, make it all less, have those highs and lows and valleys and peaks.
Yeah, but again, you still think about future, right? And you think, okay, if I just right. It's like this idea to some experiments with marshmallows when children were given like one, and you have to see it for 10 minutes, and if you don't take it, you get two. And if you take it, you don't get to. And those who were able to kind of restrict their desire to take one and to eat it, they were like later proven more successful. But yeah, against like success, it's also a very problematic idea. What is meant by success? And again, what kind of goals? For example, I've heard so many times from people, like, I don't care too much about money, and I prefer like, whenever there's debates about, how much money you should make and how much money you should save, I prefer to like take an kind of radical position and say the best way of living is like when you have zero. Like you don't need to save anything, just zero. Like you don't. If you go down, it's also a problem. So, but if you have like some savings, it creates certain condition when you have to think a lot about money. You have to think how to invest them, where to invest them, and it basically creates a kind of disturbance in your thoughts. Whenever if you live like close to zero, you don't think about money at all, and you may like dedicate your intellectual power to all sorts of scientific pursuit, art, literature, philosophy. And I often like people try to tell me like, when you get older, like when you become like 60 or 70, you'll have nothing to eat, you'll have nowhere to live, and it's a big problem. And I'm saying like you are working like every day, like 5 days, 6 days, 7 days a week, trying to save for the time which will occur like 10, 20 years from now. And you don't live now. You don't experience what's going on. Like,
and are you going to live then?
Yeah, they're like thinking, yeah. They're like, it's like I'm trying to look. I'm living now. I'm free. I have all my time. I may dedicate as many hours as I want to anything, and do like what I really want to do instead of just thinking too much about the future. Yeah, but there still must be some balance. Like just living in now. I think sometimes you also may just be lost in your certain impulses, which like the same idea playing video games. Sometimes I just get mad and play for weeks, and it's just for me just living in this present moment because this is so much joy, there's so much pleasure, but at the same time I have to understand that couple of years of such pleasure and I'm dead.
Well, I have a close friend who's used to play bass in my band, and he is a great example of somebody who lives more or less just in the present moment. He owns, his possessions are like a van that he's converted to have solar panels and even I believe running water. It's like a 15-seat passenger van. He'll park it out at the studio where he works as an intern, basically. I don't think he'll get paid if he brings somebody else into the studio and records them on his own, which he does. But and then like, for example, he's a guitar tech, so he set up my guitar the other day and I paid him some money, and he does little things like that to make money to eat. But he has no job. He technically has no home, although he has enough friends where he can kind of like go around a lot. And then he hasn't been, normally back when I was in a band with him and then he joined another band after he left ours, he's touring and traveling around the country. Most of us, we have like homes and apartments and rent to pay and significant others and roommates and people who can like help us out with that and watch the homestead while we're gone. His attitude was, I don't need a home. I don't need all these things. These possessions just sort of tie me down. And so I always look at him as an example of how you can live that way. He's been more or less homeless since I've known, not since I've known him, but for like the past like 7 or 8 years, quote unquote homeless. Like he doesn't sleep on the streets, but he doesn't have a definite address. He doesn't have an address tied to his name. He doesn't have a bank account. He doesn't have any of this. So you can live that way. And that's his life philosophy. And I admire the hell out of it. But, as you say, I am a little bit more in the middle. I don't live entirely like that way, but I also am not, I definitely, through the career choices I've chosen, I'm not building a career for myself that's going to have a significant 401k or anything. So
what do you think about experiences that one has to have in life to understand Nietzsche? Like, there's definitely like his works are not for everybody, and it's not simply like reading one or another philosopher and then coming to Nietzsche and now you understand everything. You have to have certain experiences. Like, what kind of experience, in your view?
That's a very good question. I mean, the cop out would be to say that it will be different for everybody, but I'll try to give you something better than that. I think that so I'll speak from myself. I think that when I've been in like the depths of like an existential crisis, I think people who are either not part of any traditional religious framework or who have left such a framework and they go searching for meaning, and you go searching for it through philosophy and knowledge that you can glean in the world, eventually you realize there is a limit of knowledge. And I think, so another important thing maybe in this discussion or of experiences is that with Nietzsche, I like had to circle back to Nietzsche multiple times, where I would read him and it would send me on sort of I don't want to say an existential crisis in and of itself, but it would tear down a bunch of things for me. But then it's like my understanding wasn't fully there. And then I go a bunch of have more life experiences and read Nietzsche again. It's like, oh, okay, I'm getting more. And so I think for me, at least, I've always been this philosophical type living in this world of abstract thoughts and everything. And I came to perceive sort of the same thing that Nietzsche did, that there's sort of a paradox of truth there, that he brings it up in Beyond Good and Evil. If we ask ourselves, out of our own search for the truth, what is the value of knowing the truth? You realize, oh, I can't use my truth seeking to determine that the truth is valuable. That has to be like an axiomatic demand or just a statement that I make about what I want out of life. And then you realize, oh, all of our truth seeking is based on untruth. All of our, what would you say, most cherished beliefs are based on like prejudices and assumptions. And so then naturally people think, and as I did, is there something beyond just simple assumptions and perspectives and all these things? And when you look for that, you find that a lot of philosophers, well, maybe not a lot, but many of them turn to mysticism or religion, or esotericism or occultism or something like that. Something, how do I have a direct experience of the noumenon, right? I don't want to just talk about it. How does this actually make a difference in what I do or what I think or how I experience? I want to know what's beyond all this. And so for me, that was Buddhism for like 5-6 years. And so, I mean, notice what I just said is like, initially I read Nietzsche and he pushed me into religion because, but then after doing that for so long, that was my own experience of the free spirit passing through a conviction. You realize, like, I don't know, I think, so maybe one of the experiences that's very valuable for people to understand Nietzsche is to pass through a religious conviction of some kind, and then abandon it, and then kind of come back to where I came back to the starting place. And that was where I picked up Nietzsche again. And that's where it really clicked. And that was after years and years of reading Nietzsche and then picking up, putting down. That was like when I read every book by Nietzsche at that point. I was like, okay, there's something really interesting here. And another thing maybe in my own life is like, I had also tried, what would you say? I had taken a very vulgar and unsophisticated view morally of what Nietzsche was saying, and thought, oh, I can live for the now in the sense of just pursuing pleasures. That's what life is, right? And then you realize, like, I think when you, maybe without getting too personal, when you get to the point of realizing that that does not bring you happiness in the like a real substantial sense, and that is the last man, basically. That's, I think, so maybe what I'm describing here is when you've had a series of experiences of like losing faith in a lot of the things that Nietzsche lost faith in, going back to what we were talking about at the very beginning, the lexicon of terms that he uses, you start to see these concepts and they can slot in with your own experience of like, oh, this is what I was experiencing. I was living like the last man. That's really what clicked for me. It's like, oh, I just wanted to preserve myself and have pleasure and avoid pain. I thought that was I thought that was the takeaway of all morality is relative, right? And then you realize, like, oh no, it's not. That's not life. That's a sophisticated form of dying, right? It's nihilism, because all life is about bringing forth something new and something beyond yourself, right? And so you kind of mentioned that earlier with like well, how do we fit that in with Nietzsche's rejection of metaphysics? And it could even be something as simple as organisms don't live forever. They have offspring. They bring on something new, something beyond themselves. So too with like a philosophical type, like somebody like Socrates who doesn't have kids. Socrates reproduces intellectually, creates something beyond himself that lives, that has value beyond his own individual existence. And so for me, I guess it was being born. And another thing, like my parents, they didn't give me any firm values to believe in when I grew up. They're both like ex-Catholic hippies. They gave me values, but they're all like what you would call pliant values. Like they're like, oh, you should be a decent person. Why? Well, that's a good thing to do. You should respect other people's beliefs and their culture. It's like just this sort of like relativistic, like, try and be a good person, but they didn't really give me anything, like any solid ground to stand on. And so I think if you're that kind of person and you've then experienced sort of like the limits of living just for ordinary pleasures or hedonic pleasures, if you've experienced the limits of what a traditional religion can bring you, I don't know. I think Nietzsche is for people. I hope this is making sense. I think Nietzsche is really will resonate with people once they've maybe experienced that same cynicism that he did, seeing through all of these things that you once believed in or you once lived a certain way, and then you see, oh, this doesn't work, or there's some sort of fundamental flaw with it, or it's not really real, or it's a misunderstanding of how life works, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
So it's like almost what we discussed at the beginning, like becoming the free spirit, right? So you just overcome your own beliefs and go beyond them.
It's why when people pick up Nietzsche and they're like 19 years old and in college and they're just like want to just reject things because that's cool, or they have that detached ironic coolness, and Nietzsche helps them do it. They don't really understand Nietzsche, because I think Nietzsche, he lived a life of a lot of pain and alienation and solitude, and you have to have a little bit of that. You have to beat your head against the wall a little bit and come to the end and be like, oh, what is this all about? And actually feel that pain. And I don't know. I think that's what it is. You have to come to that same ending point, that same limit, that point of, it's like the camel and the lion and the child that he talks about in Zarathustra. The camel takes in all of these ideas and beliefs. That's just what you inherit. And that's learning your conviction, understanding your conviction. The lion then comes and attacks it. You shouldn't try to do the lion first and attack before you've taken on all of these framework. That's what a lot of people try to do. But then, once you've reached the point of the lion and you're like, I've destroyed all these things I used to believe in, then there's the child, the creative child. Create something new. Live again, grow.
Okay. Yeah, I think this is the right time to stop it. We've been talking for
we went for a long time, didn't we?
2 hours.
Sorry, I talk a lot.
Yeah, that's exactly what we're supposed to do here. Just discuss ideas and understand them. So thank you for the conversation. It was really interesting and fascinating.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun.
Yeah, I guess I actually would touch just four questions. 5. There's 5 more, and probably I'll come up with new one in the future, so we continue it later.
Yeah.
Okay. So